Hello everyone, Alex here from warnoffkeys.com, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can create a verification channel command. So this is going to make it so no one can actually see any of your channels until they actually add a reaction to an existing message. So for a quick demo, let's say I have this message right here. I can then do !set verification. I can then add in a reaction such as a check mark, and then I can get a role ID that I want to give them. So I can go into my server settings, into my roles. Normally you'd use a verified role that would have access to actually reading most of your channels, but for simplicity, I'm just going to choose a JavaScript role that doesn't technically do anything. I'm going to paste that in here. If I run that, it'll now add the reaction. And if I look on my user, we see that I have the JavaScript role. If I get rid of it, and then I click on this reaction right here, and then I go back into my user, we see we now have a JavaScript role. So this is what we're going to be building. Of course, you're going to want to set up that role that you want to use. So this is what we're going to be building in this video. Of course, JavaScript should be replaced with a role that actually has the ability to read and write in most of your text channels, and that @everyone or the default role should not have the ability to until they actually verify themselves by clicking on this check mark. So real quick, before we get started, if you need help with anything, feel free to leave a comment down below or join the Warnoff Keys Discord, and someone will be able to help you there. So with that said, let's get started. So here I have this project we've been working on throughout the series. A link to this will be in the GitHub repository, which can be found in the video description. And to start things off, I'm going to create my schema first. There's three things we're going to be creating in this video. The first one is the schema, which will be actually the blueprint of the data we want to hold in our database. The second one will be our actual command, which will be able to actually set up a verification channel. And then the third thing is going to be an actual feature, which will then listen for reactions and then apply the role. So we'll start with the schema. So within my schemas folder, I'm going to make a new file. This file is going to be called verification channels-schema.js. Now within here, we have to first import mongoose. So constant mongoose equals require mongoose. And then we're going to create an actual schema. So constant verification channels schema equals mongoose.schema with a capital S. We're going to have an object in here. And before we actually define the object we want, we're going to go up here and create a required string object. This is because we're going to be using this code multiple times, so I don't want to repeat myself. This object will have a type of string and required of true. Now within here, I can then have my channel ID. Actually, this is going to be the guild ID. So I'm going to add a comment here specifying the guild ID, and this will be the primary key in MongoDB, which is specified with _ID. This is going to be a required string. And then we're going to have the channel ID, which will also be a required string. And then we're going to have the role ID, which will also be a required string. This is why I put this inside of an object here, so we don't have to repeat these two lines every single time. We can just reference the required string object. Now we can actually export this. Let me move my console slightly out of the way here. I can then say module.exports equals mongoose.model. The first argument is going to be the name of our collection, which will be verification-channels. The second argument is going to be the actual schema that we just created. So I could say verification channel schema. Now we can save and close this file. We now want to actually use this within a command. So I'm going to go inside my commands directory. I'm going to go inside of MISC, and I'm going to make a new file. This will be called set-verification.js. Now this is using Commando. If you want to use a different command systems, feel free to do so, but you'll have to understand the actual concepts here to be able to apply those to the command system that you are using. So within Commando, I do have to import Commando and then export a class which extends commando.command. So an example of that, we can say constant commando equals require discord.js-commando. And then I can say module.exports. This is going to be a class called set verification command. And this class is going to extend another class. So extends, and that will be commando.command. This will inherit all of the functionality from the command class. And within that, we can then access our constructor. So this is going to be ran whenever a new instance of this class is created. And this will have one argument, which is our client. And within here, we want to call the constructor of the command class. To do that, we have to call super. And this takes in two arguments. The first one is the client. The second one is some object. And this is going to have some different options, such as the name of our command, which will be set verification. We can then have group, which will be misc, and this is defined down here in my index file. Whenever we're registering things with commando, we have our misc commands right here. And if you do want to actually register this in a different way, or if you need help with commando, I do have a video on how to create commands using commando. A link to that will be in the video description. Next, we want the actual member name, and that will be the same thing as set verification. And then we have a description. We'll say sets the verification channel for the Discord. And then we can say user permissions. This is going to be an array of permission nodes that the user who is running the command must have. In this case, I'm just going to use administrator. Of course, you can use whatever permissions you want. And then I'm going to have args type be multiple. Args type being multiple means that any arguments sent into the command are going to be separated inside of an array instead of one giant string. And we'll see why we need that here in a few moments. We then want to have our async run function, which will be ran whenever the command is actually ran. And we're going to have access to two different arguments here. The first one is the message. The second one is the arguments. The first thing we want to do here is make sure that we have a valid arguments array. So with that said, I can say if args.length is not exactly equal to 2, we then want to complain to the user. So I can say message.reply. You must provide an emoji to react with and a role ID. I can then say message.delete. Now, inside of message.reply, we're actually going to get a callback so we can handle whatever happens after the message is actually visible. So I'm going to use .then, and this is going to give me access to the actual message. From here, I can then say message.delete, and this would immediately delete it, but I want to delete this after 3 seconds. So within this function, we're going to have another object, which will have a timeout property, which is how long to actually wait to delete it. Now this is something I'm going to be using a couple times, so I'm going to define a length in seconds. So right here I can say constant seconds equals 3. You can change this to whatever you want. The timeout expects milliseconds, and there's 1000 milliseconds in a second. So I can say 1000 times seconds, and this will give us 3000. But now using this calculation here will mean that we can change the seconds constant on line 18 to whatever duration we want. We can change this to 10, and then every single time we're using timeout of 1000 times seconds, that will then automatically update. So I'm going to keep it at 3. And then also within this if statement block, we want to make sure that we return. Now at this point, we have an actual check to make sure that we are passing in the correct number of arguments. We then want to gain access to the guild and the channel. So constant guild and channel. We are going to destructure these from the message object. And now we're going to want to access the emoji as well as the role ID from the arguments. Now, again, arg type being multiple here on line 11 is going to mean that args is going to be an array. And so I can say let emoji equals args index 0, and then let role ID equals args index 1. Actually, I can use const here on role ID, but we need to use let on emoji because we're going to actually possibly edit this depending on what the user entered. So real quick, I'm going to just console log emoji, and we're going to do some testing here so I can show you the difference between a built-in reaction, or built-in emoji rather, and a custom one on the server, and how we can apply functionality for either one. So I'm going to save this, and going into my console, I can run this with node index.js. So I can then go back into Discord, and under my test, I can then run !set verification. And it's going to say you must provide an emoji to react with and a role ID. And then it deletes itself after 3 seconds. So I can then add, let's say, a check mark. And then for a role ID, right now we're not checking to see if it's a valid role, so I can just say test. And if we look in the console, we see an actual emoji right here, an actual reaction. Now, if I were to use a custom reaction, so set verification, :JavaScript, for example, and then I can say test as the role ID, we're going to see this string here. So we're going to want to access the actual name of the reaction or the ID, either one. I prefer to use the name, and then we want to fetch the actual reaction object from the guild or from the Discord server based off of the data that you get from this string. So to do that, instead of console logging, so I'm going to remove this right here, we are then going to say if emoji dot includes a colon, which means that a colon is inside of this string. So if this if statement condition right here is true, that means that we're going to run this code within this scope. And now within here, we need to actually access the name of the emoji and then fetch that from the guild. So first we want to split this into an array. So here we see :JavaScript :ID. And so we can split this up on the colon. So const split equals emoji.split : and now we're going to have an array within this split constant that we can then access the first index, which is going to be JavaScript. So I can then say constant emoji name equals split index1. And so now we have access to JavaScript in this case. I can then access the emoji. So I can say emoji equals guild.emojis.cache.find. And this is going to give us a callback function. And this function will be ran on every single emoji in this guild. So we're going to get an emoji object as an argument. And now we have to return it true or false depending on if this is the emoji we want. Whatever one is returned true is going to be set inside of the emoji variable, and it's going to stop looping through all of the emojis. So with that said, we want to return true if the current emoji that we're looping through in this callback function is going to match the same name as emoji name. So we can simply just say return emoji.name is exactly equal to emoji name, which is going to return true if this condition is true, which means that we have found the emoji we want. Now at this stage, outside of this if statement here, we have the correct emoji, whether that's a custom or a default emoji. Now we want to gain access to the actual role based off the role ID. We want to validate that that role actually exists. So I can say constant role equals guild, which we have already destructured here on line 31. So we can say guild.roles.cache.get. We can pass in the role ID. Now at this point, we can say if not role. In this if statement, we're going to know that that role doesn't exist. So I can say message.reply. That role does not exist. And then this is going to give us another callback. So I can use .then, and this is going to give me access to the message. Now, similar to what we did previously, we're going to try and delete this after a certain number of seconds. So I can say message.delete. This is going to pass in an object inside of this function, where we can set the timeout property of 1000 times seconds. Now, after this entire function call right here, we're wanting to also delete the message that the user sent. So we're going to say message.delete. And then we also want to return to make sure we don't continue on with functionality whenever the role doesn't exist. Now at this point, we know we have a valid emoji and we know we have a valid role. We then want to delete the message that the command was ran with. So message.delete. And this is going to have no arguments this time, so it's going to immediately delete it. And then we're going to get a callback here, or this actually uses a promise, so we can use .then. And so this is going to allow us to run code after we know that the message was deleted. So within this callback, we can then run some functionality to fetch the existing messages in the channel and to store some information into the database. So within here, we want to access a channel, which we have already destructured on line 31. So I can say channel.messages.fetch, and this is going to have an object. And here we can say limit is 1, so it's only going to return the first message. And this is why we want to wait for this message to be deleted, so it is ignored. So then this also returns a promise, so I can use .then. This is going to give us a messages object. I can actually rename this to results, just to not get it confused with message or this messages right here. Results is a very different name than we've used before, and so it's unique and easier to understand. Now at this point, we want to gain access to the first message. So I can say constant first message equals results.first. And this is going to return null if the channel is empty. Otherwise, it'll return the message object for the latest message. So with that said, we can make sure that a message actually exists by saying if not first message. So if the first message is null, this if statement will run here, and then we can complain to the user. We no longer have a message to reply to, so I can just say channel.send. There is no message to react to. And then we can use .then, which will give us access to the new message. And then we can delete this with message.delete. We can pass in a timeout just like we have been doing. So timeout will be 1000 times seconds. Then after this, we want to make sure we return so we don't continue code execution whenever there's nothing to actually react to. Now at this point, we want to actually react to the first message using our emoji. So after the if statement, I can say first message react, and we can pass in our emoji, which we know is a valid emoji. Now after this, we want to actually connect to Mongo and save the information to the database. So scrolling up to the top of our file, I'm going to import Mongo. So constant Mongo equals require @util/Mongo. Now this is the path I'm using because I am using an npm package called module aliases. That is something I've covered on the channel before. If you do have a relative path, then you can use the .. to navigate to your actual folder to then access your file wherever that might be. That is up to your own implementation on where your Mongo file is, but I'm just going to use @util/Mongo. We also need to import the schema that we created. So going to schemas, we see it's called verification channels-schema. So I can then say const verification schema equals require @schemas/verification-channels-schema. Again, this is using @schemas from the module aliases package, but you can just use relative paths to navigate into this actual folder to access this file here. So now we can actually connect to Mongo and then update our verification schema for the exact guild that we're in. So scrolling back down right here, we want to be able to connect to Mongo, which means we have to use await, which means that our function that we're inside of, which is defined right here, has to be asynchronous. So to do that, I can just simply say async before the arguments. And then down here, I can say await Mongo. This is going to return a promise. So .then, which will give us a mongoose object, but this function also has to be asynchronous, so async mongoose. And then within here, I'm going to use a try finally statement to ensure that our connection is closed after we're done with it. So I can say try this code, and then finally, I can say mongoose.connection.close. Now within the try block, I'm actually going to update our schema. So I can say await, which is why we had to make this asynchronous because we're using await here. And then I can say verification schema.find one and update. This is going to take in 3 parameters. I'll put in empty objects for now. The first parameter is going to be the condition or the filter, which is going to allow us to find the actual object. In this case, that's going to be our unique ID, which is _ID in Mongo, and that's going to be guild.id. The second object is going to be what to insert or update, depending on if this document exists or doesn't exist. And so we do have to include the ID again. And then we also have to include the channel ID. So channel ID will be channel.id. And then we can have the role ID, which I'm just going to add in here. And then we'll use the same exact name as role ID, but also the value as line 45, which is our arguments. Now, channel ID, role ID, and _ID are the exact things we put inside of our schema, which are required, and that's why we're saving them with those exact names. So the capitalization is important. We see that I only have an uppercase I here, and so that's the exact thing I have right over here, uppercase I on the channel and the ID. Now at this point, we can actually go ahead and test this and make sure that we're actually connecting to the database and saving the information. So I can save this file, and I can then go in and restart my bot. So going back in here, I'm going to try running the same exact command. So I'm going to delete these 2 messages, and then I'm going to say set verification. I'm going to change this reaction to my check mark that I usually use. And now if I go to run this, we still have test here. This is going to say that role doesn't exist, and then it's going to delete this after 3 seconds. So I'm going to paste this in, and then I'm going to get an actual role ID. So into server settings, I can go into roles, I can go into JavaScript, I can just right click and copy ID. If you don't see this copy ID, then you have to enable developer mode on your Discord account. Going back, I can replace test with the actual role ID. I can then press enter, and it's going to delete the message and then add in this reaction automatically. Now if I go into Mongo Atlas, I can then click on refresh, and scrolling down, we then see verification channels. I can click on that. We're going to see this one document here. The ID is going to be the guild ID, and the channel ID will be the channel we used. Role ID will be the ID for the JavaScript role. That means that we're saving to the Mongo database correctly. Now the last thing we have to do is actually listen for reactions whenever someone reacts to the message that we sent, such as clicking on this check mark right here. So to do that, I'm going to close this. I'm going to stop the bot, and I'm going to minimize all of our files. I'm going to go inside of our features and our subfolder features, and I'm going to make a new file. This file will be called verification module-channels.js. And within here, we're going to say module.exports equals client. And now this file is going to be automatically ran and imported if you are using my loads feature file, which you can find in the GitHub repository. This is essentially going to do the same thing as my old advanced command handler. It will loop through all of the files within the features subdirectory right here. So all of these files, and it will actually run those passing in the client. So I'm going to make a function above this. So constant, this is going to be called populate cache. And we're going to just simply have this have a client argument here, and then an empty body. We'll come back and add stuff into this function soon, but within our actual thing, our actual function here, we want to then run populate cache. We want to pass in our client, and then we want to listen for message reaction add. So I can say client.on message reaction add, and this is going to give us two arguments. The first one is the reaction, the second one is the user. Now within here, we want to gain access to the channel ID. So I can say const channel ID is going to equal reaction.message.channel.id. And then we also want the role ID. But before we do that, we have to create a constant at the top of our file. This is going to be a cache that will actually store the information for which channel is going to give what role. So I can say constant verification cache equals an empty object. And like I have been doing throughout this series, I'm going to add a comment, which will describe how this object will be set up. So we'll have the channel ID and then the role ID. Now, if the value here is null, that means that nothing is actually set up for that channel. So here I can say const role ID equals verification cache index of channel ID. Now I can use an if statement to make sure that role ID is not null, therefore saying that is there an actual role that's supposed to be given from this channel? And then within here, we can destructure the guild from the message. Like I say constant guild equals reaction.message. And now I can access the actual member. The reason why we're doing this is because the user is useful in some cases, but you cannot do things such as give or remove roles. And so we have to access something called a guild member instead of a user. And so the ID for the user and the guild member is the same, but the guild member is going to have more functionality. So we need to access that from our guild, which is why we're also destructuring the guild from the message itself. So I can say const member. This is going to equal guild.members.cache.get. We can pass in user.id. And then from here, we can say member.roles.add. We can pass in role ID. This will actually give the member the role. Okay, so scrolling up, we're actually going to work for this populate cache function. This is actually going to be fairly simple because this is going to call another function, which will be a little bit more complicated. But real quick, I made a mistake already. I noticed that this verification cache is using const. We want to actually use let here because we are going to reassign a empty object to verification cache in the very first line here. So verification cache is an empty object. And then this will also be a function that will continuously be ran. So we can use set timeout. And this is going to take in two arguments. The first one will be the function to run. The second will be the delay. So the function to run will be populate cache. So it is going to call itself again. This will be after 10 minutes. So we know that 1000 milliseconds is 1 second. So we have 1 second here times 60. So then we have 1 minute. I could then do times 10, and this will be 10 minutes. Now after this, we're going to want to call a function called fetch data. And this is going to be an asynchronous function. So we have to make this function asynchronous because we have to use await here. So await fetch data. This is going to take in the client as an argument. And now we have to actually write this function. So above populate cache, I'm going to make another function. This is called fetch data, which will be an asynchronous function that has the client as the only argument. And within here, we're going to actually connect to Mongo and then fetch the data from the collection. So with that said, we do have to import Mongo and we do have to import the actual schema. At the top of our file, I can say const Mongo equals require @util/Mongo. And then I can say constant verification schema equals require @schemas/verification-channels-schema. So it's going to be the exact file name that you used within your schemas folder. Now within this function here, I can then add a console log. This would be saying fetching data. This is useful for in the future when we're testing it. I'll show you why at the time. But for now, we want to simply connect to Mongo. So I can say await Mongo. So this is going to be an asynchronous function. So async mongoose. And now within this function here, I can use try and finally. And within the finally block, I can make sure that we're closing the connection when we're done with it. So mongoose.connection.close. And then within the try block, we're going to fetch all of the results from the collection. So I can say constant results equals await verification schema dot find. And then from here, I can then loop through all of the results. So results will be an array. I can say for const result of results. And then within here, we want to access the guild. So because result is going to be an object that is going to match the exact schema here, we know that underscore ID will be the guild ID. It'll also have access to the channel ID and the role ID within that object because those are required strings to actually be inserted. So I can say constant guild equals client.guilds.cache.get, and I'm going to pass in results._ID, which will be the guild ID. Now to make sure the guild exists, we can simply say if guild. Now at this point, we know we have a valid guild, and I want to access the actual channel. So const channel equals guild.channels.cache.get. We can pass in result.channel ID. Now we want to make sure this is an actual channel, so I can say if channel. And then from here, we can say verification cache is going to have index of results.channel ID equal result.role ID. And then I can say channel.messages.fetch. Now the reason why we're doing this is because if there was a message that was sent when your bot was offline or before you actually installed the bot on your server or something like that, then this function right here, this event rather, will not actually be ran because the message that it is reacting to is not inside the cache, and therefore Discord.js does not know about it. So what we're going to do here is whenever we are fetching the data, which we have to do anyway, we are also going to fetch all the messages. That way your bot knows about them and it'll actually fire the event message reaction add whenever someone actually adds a reaction. If you do not do this and your bot was offline when a message was sent, this event will never be fired whenever your actual users click on the reaction. Now the last thing I want to do, which is why we separated these into multiple functions, is I want to export fetch data. That way, whenever we run the command to actually set a verification channel, we can then call this function. That's also why I added a console log right here. That's also why the populate cache is so simple. So we can simply reset the cache, fetch the data, and then only recall the populate cache function here. So scrolling down, I can then say module.exports.fetch equals fetch data. I can then save this, and we want to actually access and call this function within our command. So scrolling up to our commands, under misc, I can go to set verification, and then scrolling up, I want to actually import this. So I can say const, we're going to have an empty object here because we're going to destructure fetch. This is going to equal require at features / verification -channel. -channels actually, because there's an S at the end of it. Now we want to destructure fetch. And now scrolling down to the bottom of our file, we can figure out where we're done with Mongo by clicking on the opening curly brace, and we can see the highlighted ending curly brace. After this line, we want to say await fetch. Now at this point, we've entered something to the database, and then we're going to call the fetch function. So I'm going to save this file here and close it. Going back to verification channels, whenever we actually call that, it is then going to load the information from the database again. So that way that the verification cache has the most up-to-date information. So going back to Discord, I can then run the bot with a node index.js. Okay, so I actually just noticed I made a mistake earlier. Here on line 15, I'm saying results._ID. This should be result._ID. So we're accessing the current result that we are looping through and not the actual array. So if I save this and I run the code with node index.js, we then see fetching data. Going into Discord, I do not have the JavaScript role at the moment, but if I click on the verification icon, going back, we then see I have the JavaScript role. Now again, you obviously don't want to add a JavaScript role, you'd rather add a verified or a member type role that is going to give people access to reading and writing in all text channels, and without this role, you're going to want to configure it so no one can actually read or write in the text channels. Now, typically the server owners who are using your bot will have that responsibility of setting that up, and they should know how to do that. But this is how you're going to add this functionality to your bot for a verification channel. Thanks for watching this Discord.js tutorial. If you want to learn more about Discord.js, consider clicking on the playlist you see on your screen now. If you need help, feel free to leave a comment or ask in the Worn Off Keys Discord, which can be found in the video description.